September 2nd, 1973, Las Vegas Hilton, backstage after Elvis's closing night performance. Elvis Presley, 38 years old, walked into a private meeting room where Colonel Tom Parker sat surrounded by contracts, lawyers, and RCA executives. Everyone thought this was just another business meeting, another negotiation, another deal where the Colonel would take his 50% and Elvis would smile and sign. But this time was different. Elvis looked at the man who'd controlled every aspect of his career for 18 years and said 7 words that made Colonel Parker's face turn white. "You're fired. Get out of my life." The room went silent. Completely, utterly silent. Because nobody spoke to Colonel Tom Parker like that. Not Elvis, not RCA, not even the President of the United States. What happened in the next 45 minutes would be the most explosive confrontation of Elvis's career. Elvis would reveal secrets about the Colonel that shocked everyone in that room. The Colonel would threaten, manipulate, and finally beg. And by the end of it, one man would walk out victorious while the other would lose everything. But here's the twist. The man who walked out wasn't the one you'd expect. This is the true story of the day Elvis Presley tried to fire Colonel Tom Parker, and why, despite everything, he ultimately couldn't do it. To understand why Elvis finally snapped in September 1973, you need to understand what had been building for years. Elvis and Colonel Tom Parker's relationship began in 1955 when Elvis was just a poor kid from Memphis with a regional hit record. The Colonel, whose real name was Andreas Cornelius van Kuyk, an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands, saw in Elvis the biggest money-making opportunity of his life. The Colonel was a carnival barker, a con man, a genius manipulator who'd managed country stars before, but Elvis was different. Elvis was a phenomenon, and the Colonel knew exactly how to exploit that. From the beginning, the deal was unusual. Most managers took 10 to 15% of an artist's earnings. The Colonel negotiated 25%, then 33%. By the early 1970s, the Colonel was taking 50% of everything Elvis earned. Half, and that wasn't even the worst part. The Colonel made decisions that were clearly not in Elvis's best interest. He sold Elvis's entire song catalog back to RCA in 1973 for $5.4 million, a fraction of what it was worth. Elvis received only $2.7 million after the Colonel took his cut and lost all future royalties on every song he'd ever recorded. He refused to let Elvis tour internationally. Never, not once. Elvis desperately wanted to perform in Europe, Japan, Australia, but the Colonel always said no, with increasingly strange excuses. The truth? The Colonel was an illegal immigrant who'd never become a U.S. citizen. If he left the country, he couldn't come back. So Elvis's career was limited to America because of the Colonel's secret. He booked Elvis into grueling Vegas residencies that paid the casinos where the Colonel gambled millions of dollars. The Colonel would lose $1 million in a weekend at the tables, then book Elvis for more shows to cover his debts. He refused movie scripts that would have given Elvis dramatic roles, choosing instead cheap, formulaic films that required 3 weeks of shooting and produced terrible movies. Elvis had begged for the chance to prove himself as a serious actor. The Colonel saw him as a product, not an artist. By 1973, Elvis was exhausted, physically, emotionally, creatively drained. The prescription drug use that would eventually kill him was already taking hold. His marriage to Priscilla had just ended in divorce. He felt trapped, controlled, like a puppet whose strings were held by a man who saw him only as a cash machine. The final straw came in August 1973. Elvis discovered that the Colonel had negotiated a new Vegas contract without consulting him. Another year of shows, another year of being trapped in the same hotel, singing the same songs, living the same suffocating life. "I'm done," Elvis told his father Vernon. "I can't do this anymore. The Colonel is killing me." "He made you a star, son," Vernon said. Vernon had always been on the colonel's side, dazzled by the money, intimidated by the colonel's power. "No," Elvis said quietly. "I made me a star. My voice, my performance, my connection with the audience. The colonel just took half the money for it." Elvis made a decision. He was going to fire Colonel Tom Parker, actually fire him, end the relationship, take control of his own career for the first time in 18 years. He called a meeting for September 2nd, the day after his closing show at the Las Vegas Hilton. He demanded that RCA executives be present, along with lawyers. He wanted witnesses, wanted it to be official. The colonel, sensing something was wrong, brought his own team, his lawyer, his accountants, and Tom Diskin, the colonel's assistant who handled the day-to-day manipulation of Elvis's schedule. When Elvis walked into that meeting room, everyone could see he was different. He wasn't the agreeable, conflict-avoidant Elvis they were used to. He was angry, focused, ready for war.
"Thank you all for coming," Elvis said, standing at the head of the conference table. The colonel sat at the opposite end, chomping on his cigar, looking amused. "Elvis, what's this all about?" the colonel asked, in that gravelly voice. "We've got contracts to discuss, new deals to negotiate." "That's what this is about," Elvis interrupted. "The contracts, the deals, all of it. I'm done, Colonel. I'm firing you." The room erupted, not with sound, but with shock. RCA executives looked at each other in panic. Lawyers froze. Even Vernon, sitting in the corner, went pale. The colonel didn't move. He just kept smoking his cigar, that small smile still on his face. "Now, Elvis," the colonel said calmly, "you're upset. You're tired. You just finished a run of shows. Why don't we table this discussion until—" "I'm not tired," Elvis said, his voice rising. "I'm awake for the first time in years, and I see exactly what you've done to me." "And what have I done, son?" "Don't call me son. You're not my father. My father is sitting right there, and even he's been too scared of you to tell me the truth." Vernon shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Elvis pulled out a folder of papers, documents he'd been gathering for months with the help of a new lawyer he'd hired in secret. "Let me tell you what you've done, Colonel. You sold my song catalog for $5.4 million when it was worth at least $50 million. You've taken 50% of my earnings for years, when standard management is 15%. You've booked me into venues where you owe gambling debts, essentially using me to pay for your addiction." The RCA executives were scribbling notes furiously. This was explosive. "You've refused international tours that would have earned me tens of millions of dollars. You've turned down movie roles in serious films that could have made me a respected actor instead of a joke. And you've done all of this while taking half of everything I earn." Elvis slammed the folder on the table. "So yes, Colonel, you're fired. Our contract is terminated. I'm taking control of my own career." The colonel slowly stood up. He wasn't smiling anymore. "Are you finished?" he asked quietly. "I am." "Good, because now it's my turn." The colonel walked around the table, his demeanor completely changed. "You think you can just fire me? Let me tell you how this works, Elvis. You don't fire me. Nobody fires me." He pulled out his own folder, much thicker than Elvis's. "Every contract you've signed in the last 18 years has my name on it. Every venue, every record deal, every merchandise agreement. You can't perform anywhere without breaching a contract I negotiated. You can't record music without violating agreements I made with RCA. You want to fire me? Fine, but you'll spend the next 10 years in court and you won't earn a single dollar." Elvis's lawyer leaned forward. "Those contracts can be challenged." "Challenge them," the colonel snapped. "Please, I'll bury you in litigation for years. And while we're in court, Elvis doesn't perform, Elvis doesn't record, Elvis doesn't earn. How long do you think you can survive that, Elvis? With your lifestyle, your expenses, your entourage. This was the Colonel's real power. Not charm or business acumen, but leverage. He'd spent 18 years making himself indispensable, weaving himself so deeply into every aspect of Elvis's career that removing him would mean destroying everything. "There's more," the Colonel continued. "You owe me money, Elvis, a lot of money. I've been advancing you funds for years, covering your expenses. By my accounting, you're in debt to me for over $2 million. "That's a lie," Elvis shouted. "Is it? Let's see what a court says. Let's see what happens when I file a lawsuit against you for breach of contract and unpaid debts. Let's see what the newspapers say when the Colonel sues Elvis Presley." The room was silent again, but this time it was different. This was the silence of defeat setting in.
Elvis's lawyer tried to mount a defense, arguing that the contracts were exploitative, that the Colonel had breached his fiduciary duty. But as the meeting wore on, the reality became clear. The Colonel had trapped Elvis in a cage made of paperwork. Then the Colonel played his final card. "I don't want to fight you, Elvis," he said, his voice softening back to that fatherly tone. "We're a team. We've always been a team. You think I don't care about you? I've dedicated my life to making you the biggest star in the world. Everything I've done has been for you." Elvis laughed bitterly. "Everything you've done has been for you." "That's not fair. Yes, I've made money, but so have you. You're Elvis Presley. You live in Graceland. You have planes, cars, anything you want. Who gave you that? Who took you from a kid in Tupelo to the king of rock and roll?" "I did that," Elvis said quietly. "My talent did that." "Your talent?" The Colonel shook his head. "There are 1,000 singers with talent, but there's only one Elvis Presley, and I created him. I packaged him. I sold him. Without me, you'd be playing county fairs in Mississippi." It was a devastating psychological attack, and it worked. Elvis had spent so many years being told he needed the Colonel that part of him believed it. The Colonel had found the crack in Elvis's armor. Doubt. Vernon finally spoke up. "Maybe we should think about this, son. The Colonel's right about the legal situation. And we've had a good run. Maybe we just renegotiate the percentage." "Vernon's right," the Colonel said, quickly sensing victory. "Let's not throw away our partnership. Let's fix what's broken. I'll reduce my percentage to 40%. That's fair, isn't it?" 40% was still robbery, but after demanding 50%, it sounded like a compromise. Elvis looked around the room. The RCA executives wanted the matter settled. They needed Elvis recording and performing. His lawyer was already calculating the cost of litigation. Even his father was urging him to back down. "I need some air," Elvis said, and walked out of the room. He stood in the hallway, his hands shaking. One of his entourage members, Red West, approached him. "What happened in there?" "He won," Elvis said. "Even when I had him cornered, he won." "So what are you going to do?" Elvis was quiet for a long moment. "What I've always done. Go back in there and make a deal with the devil." When Elvis returned to the meeting room 20 minutes later, everyone could see he'd made his decision. "Here's what's going to happen," Elvis said. "The Colonel stays as my manager, but the percentage drops to 40%, and that's non-negotiable. I want oversight on all contracts. I want quarterly financial statements, and I want the right to approve or reject any bookings." The Colonel nodded slowly. "Agreed. But I maintain control over negotiations with venues and networks. That's what I do best." "Fine, but no more Vegas deals without my approval." "No more Vegas deals without your approval," the Colonel repeated. They shook hands. The lawyers started drawing up the new agreement. RCA executives breathed sighs of relief. But everyone in that room knew the truth. The Colonel had won. Yes, his percentage had dropped from 50% to 40%, but he still controlled Elvis's career.
he still made the decisions. And most importantly, he'd broken Elvis's will to fight back. This wouldn't be the last time Elvis thought about firing the colonel. Over the next 4 years, there would be more arguments, more tensions. But Elvis would never again walk into a room and say, "You're fired." The colonel had taught him a lesson that day. You can't escape a trap you helped build.
Elvis Presley died 4 years later, on August 16, 1977, at the age of 42. He was still under contract with Colonel Tom Parker. After Elvis's death, the colonel continued managing Elvis's career, licensing deals, merchandising, controlling the estate. He took his percentage even after Elvis was gone. It wasn't until Priscilla Presley took control of the estate years later that the colonel was finally removed from power. By then, he'd taken an estimated $100 million from Elvis's earnings over their relationship. When Colonel Parker died in 1997, the truth about his past finally came to light. He was Andreas Cornelis van Kuyk, an illegal immigrant who'd likely fled the Netherlands after a suspicious death. He'd never been able to leave the United States because he had no passport, no legal status. That's why Elvis never performed overseas. Not because the colonel thought it was bad business, but because the colonel couldn't go with him. The September 2, 1973 meeting became legendary in Elvis's inner circle. The day Elvis almost broke free. The day he stood up to the man who controlled his life. The day he came so close to changing everything. But in the end, the colonel's greatest trick wasn't making Elvis a star. It was making Elvis believe he couldn't be a star without him. That's the real tragedy of Elvis Presley. Not that he died too young, or that he struggled with addiction, or even that he was exploited by his manager. The tragedy is that he knew all of this was happening. He tried to stop it, and he failed. Because sometimes the person holding you back isn't stronger than you. They're just more willing to fight dirty. And Colonel Tom Parker was the dirtiest fighter Elvis ever met.